So welcome everybody to our weekly class on the psychology in the Torah. And this week's Parsha really contains a wealth of material. It's very hard to decide what to talk about. But I want to dedicate the class tonight or this evening to a lesser issue that comes up in this week's Parsha, which is the repercussions of the sin of the spies. So Parshas Shlach Lecha, tells us about the decision to send spies out to see the land of Israel and then to decide, apparently, from where to enter and how to conquer it and so on and so forth. But there's an essential problem in all of this. The essential problem was that from the beginning it was a bad idea. And why is it a bad idea? And it wasn't really the spies per se who were to blame for this bad idea. It was, in a sense, the entire people. Because it should have been a no-brainer, very simple. God tells you, you came out of Egypt, you received the Torah, now it's time to go and receive the land of Israel. So you just go. In the same way that they were very clear-minded about getting to Mount Sinai and receiving the Torah. They should have just continued the same way. They've built the tabernacle, they've been forgiven for the sin of the golden calf, and now it's just a matter of getting to the land of Israel and entering. There was a promise from God that if they would enter now, they wouldn't even have to fight. Meaning there wouldn't be any wars. It would just be a acquisition, one might say. It's very interesting that in practice, the archaeological evidence doesn't seem to indicate that there were any wars, which is also very interesting, meaning that God still made good on the promise that these wouldn't be all-out wars. Even after 40 years, when they came back, these weren't wars, regular wars. They weren't wars with a siege, and the only city that was really under siege was Jericho, and that ended abruptly the way it did. There was no, big battle scene or anything like that. It just, the walls crumbled and that was it. So this idea of sending out spies was completely superfluous. There was no need for it. So what did it indicate? What does it tell us about the state of mind of the Jewish people at the time? And this is something that we can all relate to, I think. It tells us there's a very clear lack of confidence in themselves. They're not able to really do what they set out to do. And their doubts, their lack of confidence, prevents them from taking the leap. In a certain sense, entering the land of Israel was a leap of faith. But everything they had done in coming out of Egypt and receiving the Torah and building the tabernacle, these were all leaps of faith. So why was this one that much different than all the others? So there was something missing here. Something wasn't working the way it should have been working. It's sort of like when we decide that we have some goal that we want to attain in life, and we begin second guessing ourselves. We have a plan, we know what we want to do, we know how we want to achieve it, and then we start doubting ourselves. And where this doubt comes from, where this doubt in self-confidence comes from, is a very big issue. And this was the issue that Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to deal with. He was supposed to find a way to integrate into the entire generation that he had brought out of Egypt this confidence that they are capable of creating something that has never been created, that had never been created before in the world, and they would be successful in it. But Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't successful in doing this. He himself wasn't able to do it, and the result was, as we know, that they ended up having to spend 38 more years in the wilderness waiting for the generation that came out of Egypt to perish. And only their children could come into the land of Israel. Okay, so that's the background. Where it gets really complex is that right after they hear about this new edict or this new decree that they won't be able to go into the land of Israel for another 38 years, there's a group of people that decide that they will. Very interesting. There's suddenly a group of people, and we'll read it in a moment, that decide that in spite of the decree that God gave Moses that they can't come into the land of Israel now, they're going to go anyway. The question is why? Why do they do that? Why would they? They were so full of doubt about themselves. So how could they suddenly have such self-confidence? And in spite of God telling them now that it's not going to work, and Moses telling them, don't leave the camp because God is not with you, why is it that that they do decide to do it anyway? So this is going to talk about, we're going to talk about not only where do you lose your self-confidence, but also why you overextend yourself to get it back. And when you overextend yourself, you actually do yourself more harm than by just letting things be. Okay, so let's take a look at this and see the verses. So I'm going to share the screen now. The chat. Okay. Okay, let's share the screen here. So we're looking at Numbers chapter 14. And let's read about the aftermath of what happened after the spies came back. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will this people spurn me? And how long will they have no faith in me, despite all the signs that I have performed in their midst? I will strike them with pestilence and disown them, and I will make of you, meaning of Moses himself, a nation far more numerous than they. But Moses said to the Lord, when the Egyptians from whose midst you brought up this people in your might hear the news, meaning that he's destroyed the people, they will tell it to the inhabitants of that land, meaning they'll tell it to the Canaanites living in the land of Canaan now. Now they have heard that you, O Lord, are in the midst of this people, and that you, O Lord, appear in plain sight when your cloud rests over them, and when you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and in a pillar of fire by night. If then you slay this people to a man, meaning you slay them all, the nations who have heard your fame will say, it must be because God was powerless to bring that people into the land. He had promised them an oath that he saw, and because he couldn't perform the oath, he couldn't fulfill it, he slaughtered them in the wilderness. Therefore, I pray, let the Lord's forbearance be great, as you have declared, saying. And here's a verse that we're going to come back to in a few minutes. If you read the Hebrew, you might recognize it. It looks awfully like the 13 principles of mercy that God revealed to Moses after the sin of the golden calf. The Lord, slow to anger and abounding in kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, yet not remitting all punishment, but visiting the iniquity of fathers upon children, upon the third and fourth generations. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to your great kindness, as you have forgiven this people ever since Egypt. And God said, I pardon as you have asked. Nevertheless, as I am alive and as my presence fills the whole world, none of the men who have seen my presence and the signs that I have performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, and who have tried me these many times and have disobeyed me, shall see the land that I promised on oath to their fathers. None of those who spurn me shall see it. Okay. Now it ends with a very interesting verse and says, the Amalekites and the Canaanites occupy the valleys. Start out then tomorrow and march into the wilderness by way of the sea of the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. Okay. Now there's another, we're going to skip a little bit to get to the part that we talked about. When Moses repeated these words to all the Israelites, I mean, he's telling them now, you're going to be spending a lot of time in the wilderness, 40 years. The people were overcome by grief. Early the next morning, they set out toward the crest of the hill country, saying, we are prepared to go up to the place that the God has spoken of, for we were wrong. But Moses said, why do you transgress the Lord's command? It will not succeed. Do not go up. Do not try to go into the land, lest you be routed by your enemies, for the Lord is not in your midst. For the Amalekites and the Canaanites will be there to face you, and you will fall by the sword, inasmuch as you have turned from following God, and the God will not be with you. Yet defiantly they marched toward the crest of the hill country, though neither God's ark of the covenant nor Moses stirred from the camp. Indeed, what happened? And the Amalekites and the Canaanites who dwelt in that hill country came down and dealt them a shattering blow at a place called Hormah. And that was the end of that. And they pretty much accepted the fact that there's no way to overturn the decree, and now they have to go back into the desert. They're going to be there for 38 years. So again, we're going to focus now on what exactly was supposed to happen. Why did they second guess themselves? And why, at the end, did they try to overcompensate and suddenly decide that they have so much confidence that even though God has told them that there's no chance that they can now enter the land, they try it anyway? What exactly is going on here psychologically? Okay, so to understand this, we have to understand what the land of Israel represents. What exactly does it represent? It's true that it's also a real place where I happen to be sitting right now. But when we look at the Torah from a psychological point of view, we're not only looking at the history, we're not only looking at the story, we're looking at the meaning behind it. So what exactly does the land of Israel represent? The simplest thing that we can say is that the land of Israel represents the soul's yearning to be in the world. Okay? Now, this may not understand what I just said. What do you mean the soul's yearning to be in the world? We're in the world. We live in this world. What do you mean? Why does the soul need to yearn? So the answer is like this. The soul, the spiritual, the higher self, doesn't have a need for anything physical. Let me say this in a way that will make sense a lot more. If we claim that the soul is something spiritual, so why in the world would something spiritual have any physical needs? Why in the world would the soul, which is spiritual, want to expand its possessions and increase its possessions in the material world? On the face of it, it doesn't make any sense. That shouldn't happen. If you know anything about Eastern religions, Eastern spiritual practices, the thing that they scorn the most is having possessions. they claim that if you've really become spiritual, you should be beyond physical possessions. You shouldn't need any of them. And so you can live the highest level of spiritual life by necessarily rejecting materialism. And that makes a lot of sense. And so whenever people who are steeped in materialism meet Eastern spiritualism, their eyes are suddenly opened and they say, I didn't realize this. I now understand that I've been ignoring my spiritual self. I've been ignoring my higher self, and by pursuing only materialism. And they're very taken in by this. And a lot of them reject their material possessions to the great glee of the guru, who was very happy to take those possessions into his hand. But they're not all like that, just most of them. And the Westerner who suddenly realizes that spiritualism is real, there is real spirituality in the world. You can live without the all-encompassing need for more material, realizes that spirituality is very different than materialism. The interesting thing is what happens when somebody who's seen this now comes into Yiddishkeit, who now begins to discover that there's also Judaism, and he realizes that Judaism is very spiritual, but then there's some kink in the whole system, because Judaism is not against the material. It doesn't say you should forego all your material connections. So how does that work exactly? So in the Bible, in general, the land of Israel represents the soul's connection and potential to connect with the material world. And not just to connect with it, but to expand in it, to feel an expansion of the soul through the material. Why? Well, the understanding is very simple. That whatever material possessions you can acquire in the land of Israel, you can use them all as mitzvot. You can use them all as commandments. To the point where everything you do, materially or spiritually, but also materially, in the land of Israel, becomes a mitzvah. How does it become a mitzvah? One opinion, because it's a mitzvah to live in the land of Israel. So the moment that you're living in it, it's sort of like, you can think about it the way that Sukkot is a time that you sit in the sukkah, and everything that you do in the sukkah, no matter what you're doing, you're performing the mitzvah of sitting in the sukkah. So the materiality in the land of Israel becomes an opportunity to connect to God. And so you have this drive in the soul that wants to transform the material into something spiritual. And the way that that's done is by using the material in order to do something spiritual. In the Chabad tradition, for instance, you don't have to actually be in the land of Israel, because in the Chabad tradition, you take it very seriously that there is the spiritual meaning, or the symbolic meaning behind the land of Israel is always true. And so therefore you could sit in New York, or you could sit in Los Angeles or in Toronto or wherever you are, and you could do the same thing and say that I'm now sitting in the divine presence, or in the presence of the divine, and everything that I'm going to do, including making my living, including buying my groceries, including having friends over for Shabbos lunch, whatever it is. For me, these things are a form of divine service. And the moment that you make that transformation in your head, you're now living in the land of Israel as far as the soul is concerned. Because that's what the soul, that's what the land of Israel represents for the soul. It's a chance to expand spiritually within the material world. Okay, this is obviously a large topic, but I think that we've touched on the basic parts of it. What's the fear? Why would the children of Israel, as they're coming into the land of Israel, doubt themselves in their ability to really conquer the land? Meaning, translated symbolically in the psyche, that you doubt that you're able to transform the material into something spiritual. You doubt it. Why? Where does this doubt come from? Well, the doubt comes from a very natural place in the soul. Because the soul by its essence is spiritual. And again, any spiritual tradition you look at in the world, you will find that it scorns the material. And it's right for doing so. It's not incorrect. That's the right thing to do. Because spirituality should be beyond materialism. It only makes sense. But there's a deeper reason. The deeper reason is explained in Hasidic philosophy. That it's hard for us to come to terms with the notion that God is not only spiritual. It's a very hard concept because we tend to search for God in the spiritual, and we tend to associate the material as being ungodly. Where does this come from? Well, I can't say I would like to blame Christianity, but it can't. Because it's not just a Christian concept, it's all over the world. It's a natural tendency of the soul to feel this. So where does this come from? So it's very interesting where this comes from and how it appears in us. And I want to dedicate a few minutes to explain it because it's an eye-opening concept that Chassidus discusses. And it says like this. Why does each one of us feel that we're unique? Why do we feel that we're special? Where does that come from? Chassidus says something amazing. It says it comes from our godly nature. The soul feels like a residue from the fact that God is unique and special, and it projects it on ourselves. The soul which knows God intimately knows that God is unique and special. He's different from everything that you'll encounter in life. And so he's unique, he's special. He can't be physical because there's nothing special about and unique about the physical. The physical is all the same, right? I hope we're convinced of that. You can't have a singular edition orange. There's no such thing. There's as many oranges as you want, and they're all the same. You can't have a special edition of a horse because they're all the same. You're right. There are those who are faster, those that are slower, but in the end, they're all horses. When we say that God is unique, we mean that he's not a horse and he's not an orange. Like Maimonides very naturally says, he's not anything that you know. So if he's not anything that I know, so what's left? So the normal way that most people will phrase this in their minds is that God is unique because he's not physical. The physical repeats itself, but there must be something beyond the physical. And normally we associate and we say that the spiritual is not physical, the spiritual is beyond the physical. And so that's what makes God unique. But that's exactly what makes us unique. How are we unique? Well, somebody might say, I wear this shirt. Yeah, but there's not one shirt like this. There's many like it. So there's a lot of people wearing this shirt. It's the makeup I put on. There's a lot of women are putting on the same makeup. It's the car I'm driving. A lot of people have the same car. You see something really strange that people try to find something unique. They try to make their house into something. But what are we doing? Really, in the end, it's an attempt to mimic God. It's an attempt to find godliness. It's a very deep concept. That whenever we're looking to be unique, whenever we feel ourselves to be unique, what we're doing is we're connecting to God. We're looking for God in reality. We're looking for God in ourselves because we have a residue left over from when the soul was one with God, that God was unique, he was different. So the natural tendency is to search for God being different from everything that we've seen. Different from anything that is physical. That's how it translates for most of us. And so in almost every single spiritual tradition in the world, God is associated with the spiritual. Again, whether this is correct or not, somebody might say the spiritual is less unique than the material. Because in the spiritual realm, if I'm thinking of let's say I'm thinking of a right-sided, an isosceles triangle, okay, with a base of 2 centimeters. So I can think of that, and everybody else here can think of it, and it's not unique anymore. We all have the same picture in our heads, or we're just going to imagine a circle now, a red polka dot circle. So that's a spiritual thing because it's not here in the room. It's not by any of you either. But you're all containing the same thing in your head. Is the number 1 unique? Is the number 10 unique? Well, if we're all going to think about the number 10 right now, so there's that many copies at least of that number. So there's an argument to be made that spirituality is no more unique than physicality is. But most people don't make that argument for the same reasons that most of us don't care, because it's philosophical. It's not, you don't really deal with these things on a day-to-day basis. On a day-to-day basis, unique means something spiritual. It means something at least not physical. It's something beyond the physical. By the way, it's very interesting that this Rav Steindlitz told me many years ago. I haven't seen it in writing, but he said that it exists somewhere. He said that the reason that Jefferson came up with the idea of 1 vote per 1 person was exactly based on this notion that every individual is unique. And so therefore, every individual should get a unique vote. Of course, in their time, individual meant white male. I don't think it was landowning anymore, but it was at least white and male. And slowly, suffrage was extended to include all human beings, at least in the United States. And the notion, again, is that each one of us is a unique individual spiritually. We have different opinions, different ideas. So when you are accustomed to finding godliness in the spiritual, it's a shock to hear that there might be godliness in the physical. What would that even mean? So this we're not going to get into right now, but this touches upon, doesn't just touch, it's actually a very important part of what we call the paradoxes, levels of paradox in reality. And just to say it quickly, the level of paradox that we can sustain by saying that beyond the material there's also God, and it's a paradox, because God is supposed to contain everything, so how come he doesn't contain the material, and so on. So that level of paradox is lower and easier to hold on to than the level of paradox that says that God is not only spiritual, he is also physical. That's a much tougher and harder sell on our ability to contain paradoxes in our head. It's a tough idea. And it's so tough, in fact, that the first time that most people hear it, they say, but isn't that exactly what Judaism as pure monotheism can't stand? Isn't that exactly what idolatry is? That when you say that God is also physical, right? Most people will come to that question very quickly. So we don't have time right now to answer it. Hopefully some other opportunity I'll get a chance to. But the short and long of it is that we're now looking right now at God, we're looking more at ourselves. And in the self, what this means is that in spite of the fact that we would not define ourselves by the material we own or that we're attached to, we do have an affinity to it. Not only do we have an affinity to it, there is a deep drive within us to connect and to acquire and to expand into more physical things. We're never content. It's called that he who has 100 wants 200. How does that work? So this needs, first of all, we have to accept that it's a paradox, because none of us would identify ourselves for real, define ourselves by our material possessions. We all understand that what makes us unique and special is not our material possessions. So why is there such a drive to have material possessions? It's a paradox. The higher level of paradox is to say that not only is this drive understandable, it's actually the highest level of spirituality. It's the highest level of self-identification. It's how we actually need to define ourselves. We need to define ourselves by our attachment to our family, by our attachment to our house, to our job, to whatever physical objects there are around us. And not just that, but also to physical actions. And the Torah has something which is shocking when you think about it spiritually, that most of the mitzvot that we do, most of the commandments are entirely physical. Why would that be the case? They should all be spiritual. Again, because the highest paradox is that God is not only spiritual, but godliness extends into the material. Just like the soul takes its cue from God. Our identity takes its cue from God. And we also want to expand into the physical. In fact, we so much want to expand into it that all of us, or almost all of us, view the end of life as a loss. Even if somebody would tell us, look, the soul is going to continue. You're not going to lose anything from your identity. But just the knowledge that I won't be in my car, I won't be in my house, I won't be with my friends, with my family, that's enough to cause us to feel that we're going to lose our identity when we come out of this world. So some attachment, some very deep attachment has already been created between the soul and the physical reality. And that is what the land of Israel represents, that attachment. And like I said, you can get that attachment anywhere. According to the symbolism of the land of Israel, wherever you decide to take your material connections and transform them into vehicles of fulfilling God's commandments, you're living in the land of Israel. You're establishing, you're manifesting the soul's need to expand into the physical world. So why the doubt? Well, the doubt, like we said, is because it's very hard to wrap our head around it in the beginning. It's very hard to accept this, that as spiritual as the soul is, it has a deep need for this connection to the physical. And so in the beginning, they really didn't want to go into the land of Israel. They really sent spies. I had a thought this year that you could read it backwards also, that Moses sending spies into the land of Israel can also be read as Moses sending spies into the afterlife, the world of the afterlife, and asking all kinds of questions about it. But we'll leave that for now. It's just food for thought if somebody wants to think about what it means. But getting back to the doubts that they had, there was a question here. Should we really strive to attach to the physical? Does it make any sense? And so there was doubt. The doubt wasn't solved. They remained in a doubtful state. And what that meant was that Moshe Rabbeinu had not done a good enough job in stressing and explaining that God also wants the physical dimension. Not only wants it, but that most of the commandments, most of the opportunities to connect to the divine are afforded us through the physical and not through the spiritual. And so as much as Moses tried to do this, in this apparently there was failure. It could be that it was also too soon, that really the people that came out of Egypt were in such a mindset that the physical is something to be rejected. It represents slavery. It represents everything that's contrary to the spiritual that they're seeking. You could ask the same question about freedom, for instance. Who's more free? The person who's living a spiritual life without any concern for the material, or the person who's living a material life with respect for the spiritual? Who's more free? Who's the freer person? The moment that you begin to accept the fact that God wants the material to be sanctified, that the vehicle for reaching godliness in life, for the soul to fulfill its mission, for each one of us to fulfill our mission in life, requires the material world, then you begin to understand that the principles of faith written by Maimonides, for instance, are only partial. They're partial because they focus on the spiritual. And they don't address the material. They don't address the physical. In other words, another way of saying it is that the principles, the 13 principles of faith that Maimonides wrote, defined from the rabbinic sources, they're like living a spiritual life outside the land of Israel. But the moment that you enter into this mindset that the material is just as much the realm of godliness, it's just as much where the soul needs to inhabit, then you need a new set of principles of faith. So we mentioned before we saw this, that there's a verse that looks an awful lot like the verse that God said to Moses after the sin of the golden calf. In Hebrew, the two verses are almost, I mean, you can right away spot that they're the same, they're cut from the exact same cloth. So, the verse here was, Hashem, Erech Apayim, V'Rav Chesed, Nosei Avon V'Fasha, V'Nakeh, Lo Yinakeh, Poked Avon Avot Al Banim V'Al Shilashim V'Al Ribeim. And the verses in Exodus were, Hashem, Hashem, Erech Apayim, Rav Chesed V'Emet, Notzer Chesed La'alafim, Nosei Avon V'Fesha V'Chata'a, V'Nakeh, Lo Yinakeh. They're almost the same. What's the difference between them? That the verses from Exodus are divided into 13 principles of compassion. The verse here in our Parsha is divided into 9. So we have 13 and 9 principles. Maimonides wrote 13 principles of faith, which suggests that there are 9 principles, 9 additional principles of faith that have to do with the material world, what we're calling here the land of Israel, which the land of Israel symbolizes. The 13 principles of faith, after the sin of the golden calf, deal with making God not material. Because what was the sin there? That they had taken the concept of God and they had associated it with a physical entity called the golden calf. So the rectification was to go back to an anti-materialistic picture. And that's what the 13 principles of faith written by Maimonides are meant to do. He starts off by saying that I believe that God, well, let's read it instead of, let me open it. I'm going to share the screen again. And here we go. Let's read them. Belief in the existence of the Creator who is perfect in every manner of existence and is the primary cause of all that exists. There's a lot of Aristotelian language here. By the way, you don't have to necessarily accept Maimonides' list. It's good to, but you don't have to. The belief in God's absolute and unparalleled unity. The belief in God's non-corporeality, meaning that he's not physical in any way, nor that he will be affected by any physical occurrences, such as movement or rest or dwelling. The belief in God's eternity, the imperative to worship God exclusively and no foreign false gods, i.e., nothing physical. The belief that God communicates with man through prophecy. Prophecy is something very spiritual. the belief in the primacy of the prophecy of Moses, our teacher, the belief in the divine origin of the Torah, the belief in the immutability of the Torah, the belief in God's omniscience and providence, meaning hashgacha, the belief in divine reward and retribution, meaning that the world is not hefker, it's not a free-for-all, there is a judge, there is judgment, the belief in the arrival of the Messiah in the Messianic era, the belief in the resurrection of the dead. Of all of them, the only one that's a little bit physical is the last one, resurrection of the dead. And then Maimonides explains what he meant, and he turns it into something spiritual again. We're not going to go into the details right now. These are the 13 principles of incorporeality, of the soul not being attached to anything physical in the world. You can do all this and not be attached to anything physical. Notice something very interesting. There's not one mention of commandments. He says that the Torah is immutable. It's never going to be changed. The Torah contains commandments. But he doesn't have a special principle of faith that we're all obliged to follow the commandments. Very interesting. Isn't that part of it? You could say it also falls under reward and punishment and all this, but he never mentions the word mitzvot. What would the 9 principles of faith that have to do with the physical world, what would they look like? Here's the list that Rabbi Ginzburg brought into the world. All these are discussed profusely in different sources, and what he did was he brought them together. So I'll say what they are now. The first one is that a new interpretation, a new understanding of Torah comes out of God all the time. The Torah is immutable, it doesn't change. But its understanding changes. How we understand it does. The second is that the mitzvot, the commandments that we do, all our divine service is needed by God. That's unbelievable. What is that saying? It's saying that God is somehow dependent on us. Is God dependent on man? Where did that come from? But it's the same as saying that the soul is dependent on the physical. The soul is dependent. It needs its attachment to the physical to grow, to become what it should be. The soul can't remain spiritual. So it has a dependence. Could God have created the world in a different way? Yes, he could have made it a different way, and there would be no dependence at all, neither for God on man, nor for the soul on the material. That's a possible world, and God could have done that. But he didn't. He chose to make a world in which he's invested. And he says, my well-being depends on what people do. And as a result, the soul feels the same thing, that the soul's well-being depends on its attachment to the physical, to do the mitzvot, to do the commandments. The next one is that the world is constantly being recreated. It's an amazing statement. Because for Maimonides, the world was created once. But when you begin to enter into the realm of the physical, which is not eternal, like the spiritual, you begin to feel that, wait a minute, in the physical realm, everything is recreated at every moment. It's a whole different picture of reality. The next one is, and we don't have time to get into all of them, because I want to get just to 2 specific ones that relate to what we started with. The next one is that all descents are for the purpose of ascent. Meaning whenever you sin, whenever you do a transgression, it's not the end of the story. Whatever you did is in order to ascend. It will be revealed that what happened was for the good. Just maybe right now. Where's this list? It's in a book called Emunah and Mudaut. It's only in English, in Hebrew. I believe that somewhere on the website we translated it once. You have to look for it. 9 Principles of Faith. The next one is, and this is you could say the central one, because that's what we're talking about, that God wants a dwelling place below, in the same way that the soul wants a dwelling place in the physical realm. I hope you understand what's going on here. You know, I'm going to take a short break now from these 9 principles and say something that is astounding, I think. The Nazis had to find some way to legitimize what they were doing in their own eyes. What was their theology? What did they believe in that allowed them to look at human beings, to look at the Jewish people and say they're what we call ois mensch? They're not human beings. What was their theology? The amazing thing is that their theology was that the material needs to be worshipped. The material is holy. And who are the ones who are the most against this idea? You know who they are. It's Jews. Because Jews scorn the material. They can't stand it. Look at them. They completely disregard the material. They have no respect for it. The Nazi religion was very pagan. That's why the Nazis also hated Christianity. Because Christianity is another form of extreme spiritualism. But of course, they couldn't go against their own people, so that wasn't the claim that was made. But if they would have followed it, it would have been consistent, then they were consistent, because the first person who said this was Nietzsche. And Nietzsche was anti-Christian. They adopted him. That's where they got their Übermensch from, their higher form of man, their Aryan race. They got it from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche saw that a God who was only spiritual was against the material. And he scorned that. And he threw it out the window. And they threw it out too. But they blamed the Jews as being the ones who had brought this into the world. And what are we saying now? We're saying exactly the opposite, that the land of Israel represents the soul's need for the material, to extend into the material, to sanctify the material, to turn the material into things, into vehicles of godliness. So much so that as we said, the 5th principle of faith that comes after the sin of the spies is this notion that God wants a dwelling place below. Below means in the material world. Now we're coming to the 6th and 7th, which are the crux of what we want to talk about. After an hour, we finally come to it. And it's this idea, the 6th one is that the righteous individual makes a decree and God fulfills it. Let that sink in a little. It's saying that who's deciding what's happening here in the world? The righteous individual. not any person, but the person who is really serving God understands that God wants him to decide what should happen. And God will act upon his decision, upon this righteous man's decision or woman. The seventh principle is that God makes decrees about the world, and he expects and allows the righteous individuals to annul those decrees. Who ever heard of such a thing? That God says something and man says no. Not just any man, obviously, but the real servant of God says no. I know that you want this decree. I understand why you want it, but no, you can't. These two correspond to the feet, because all 9 of these correspond to the Sfirot. These two correspond to victory and acknowledgement, which correspond to the 2 legs. The 8th principle is that all of the Jewish people are righteous. So that goes together with the first 2, with the 2 we just discussed. That God makes a decree and the righteous annul it, and that the righteous make a decree and God fulfills it. And who are the righteous? Who are the tzaddikim? Ve'amech kulam tzaddikim. And your people are all tzaddikim. They're all righteous. Every Jew has it within him to carry out these 2 principles that we just discussed. And finally, and this makes a lot of sense because this is what we're talking about, that there is a special quality to the land of Israel and the Jewish body, which is different from all the other lands and different from all the other bodies. You can't prove these things, or principles of faith. But they come from this understanding that the soul wants to extend into the physical realm. So what happened? In the beginning, they doubted it. But after they heard the 9 principles of compassion that came after the sin of the spies, and they thought about what they mean, they came to the conclusion that even though God made a decree that we can't go into the land of Israel for another 40 years, we can annul that decree. And even though the ark is not coming with us and Moses is not coming with us in this attempt to conquer, this ill-executed and ill thought out, and everything was wrong. So even though Moses is not coming with us, and even though the Ark of the Covenant is staying in the camp, that's called we're going to make a decree, and God will fulfill it. He'll follow us. He'll follow us up the mountain. The problem was that this only works when you really want to extend into the physical. And they had already proven and received the punishment, or received the decree at least, that they weren't interested in the physical. You can't just change your mind again. It's much more complex than that. It's not like, now I'm here, now I'm not here. You have to be whole in your heart and say that I want to live in such a way that whatever is materially in front of me, the material that I use, the material that I own, my possessions, my money, whatever I have physically, my body, these can all become sanctified. They can all be used as vehicles for sanctity. They can all be used as mitzvot. They can all be used to serve God. You have to be in that mindset. The moment that you're in that mindset, then all these principles apply. But if you're not in that mindset and you're just doing it because you're afraid that God is now angry at you, that you didn't want the physical, so that's not enough in order for you to be able to use all these principles of of uh, of the material aspect of the Torah, these principles, 9 principles of faith. So this has a lot to do with extending ourselves beyond the notion that holiness and Judaism and Torah is dealing only with the spiritual. And it's not so surprising that we don't have much of this notion, because even we who live in the land of Israel physically don't have that notion. The people who came here were looking for, one might say, for quiet, for peace and quiet. They came to the wrong place. This is not a neighborhood where you get peace and quiet. To survive here, and I have to say that we see this more and more each time. Whenever the Jews are being attacked in Israel now, they're being attacked everywhere. It's a link that's become stronger and stronger as time goes by. We may not like it, but it's a fact. It's just, you see it more and more. And so it doesn't matter now who came here and who didn't. It makes no difference anymore. In my opinion, it really makes no difference. Whether you're living in Israel, you're living in America, you're living in France, wherever you're living, we all have the same fate. There's no difference. So whether this neighborhood, the Middle East, is more peaceful or less peaceful, it doesn't matter anymore. Whenever it's not working right, it hurts us everywhere. So the key has to be that we're here, and wherever we are, we're here to transform the physical into something holy. That's what the soul really demands in the end. And when you understand that, then you can't say something like, my property is just real estate. It's not what it is. The moment that you've done a mitzvah with it, it's something entirely different. You connect to things in a different way. You cherish them in a different way. I'll take an extreme example. You could say, theoretically, I could marry any woman, or a woman could say, I could marry any man. But the moment that you've actually done it, then it's not just any other man or any other woman. This is now where I'm invested. Like the Christians like to say, for better or for worse, but I'm invested in it because this is mine. This is a belonging already. This is a possession, a physical possession, in the best possible way. That the commitment to it is sort of like, the people that adopt a pet, and 2 weeks later they see it's a lot of work, and sort of send them away. You can't do that. You can't do that with a husband. You can't do that with children. You can't do that with land. You can't just say it's real estate. Let me just find a better piece somewhere else, more quiet. It doesn't work that way. Because the moment that it's a real extension of the soul, then if you cut it off, you're cutting off something from me. You're cutting off part of my identity. So the flip-flop that they went through is meant to impress upon us that this is a serious business. You can't say one day I'm into the physical, the other day I'm not into the physical. It doesn't work that way. So the fact that they decided after they had proven that they're not into the physical, they decided to, okay, let's flap back and say that we are, and we'll go back in the land of Israel and we will succeed. And you know what, even let's use these 2 principles of faith, that we have this power to decree and we have the power to annul decrees and all this, it didn't work. Because there's much more going on than just, again, this, I would almost say, abuse of the physical in order to get what I want. If you really take on the physical and make it holy, then it has value. You attach value to it, and you attach your identity to it. And so you can't give it up just like that. In the same way that you don't go and buy something just like that. I don't know if I mentioned this, but for instance, when people get married, so according to Jewish law, there's an aspect of purchasing. It's called purchasing. But nonetheless, even though it's called that, it's nothing like purchasing. When a man marries a woman, even though one of the three ways is called purchasing, that's why we give a what do you call it? A ring. As part of the purchase aspect of a wedding. But it doesn't work like a purchase. There's no 14-day money-back guarantee. You can't do that. And this is a big deal now. This is a big deal. It became a big deal in the 70s in America, and now it's becoming a big deal here in Israel. And it's this idea that maybe sometimes you want to annul the marriage by saying that the person who bought didn't know what they were buying. And so it's like, I can return it. It makes marriage into buying a car or maybe buying a house. And that's not what it's like. It's true that, again, in the 70s, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he had no alternative. There were some marriages that had to be annulled, and the husband was not interested, and he made life miserable for years upon years. So they used that. But you can't use it all the time. It's a very, very, very special case in which you say something like that I can annul the marriage because it's like buying the wrong. I didn't know I was buying a lemon. You can't really say that. Why? Because committing to the physical is a lifelong project. It's something very serious. And it has to be taken that way. Okay, so I hope I've shed some light on this whole story of the spies. And there's a lot more material here to cover, but I couldn't not talk about this week because it's such an important topic, and it touches upon so much of what we do, and our picture of what Judaism is, and our picture of what Torah wants from us, and what the commandments are, and so on. And so I feel that this is I hope that you got something out of it. It wasn't too abstract, wasn't too spiritual, and hopefully there was enough meat on the bones to eat.